evening, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to today's lecture. Today, we're going to be talking about Assyrian history and mainly the Christian period. So that period is approximately from 33 AD until today. Well, let me tell you, when we say 33 AD, what are we talking about? We're talking obviously about the life of Christ, the end of the life of Christ, and the coming of the disciples and later the apostles of Christ, the 12 and then the 70. We're also, when we're looking at this period, this early period, we're talking about what a term that I want you to get to know, which is apocryphal literature, which means literature that typically is written much later after after a few centuries, perhaps, or a couple of centuries of the time. And so typically these literary creations are made to kind of bolster the legitimacy, typically of the church and of the saints and so on. So I would say be aware that some of the items I quote, I may not say it in every single instance, but some of the stuff is obviously embellished or created. But you may be concerned about the facts, but also be concerned about the larger truth here, which is that, you know, Assyrian Christianity definitely took hold. Was it something that was created overnight? Did the Assyrians, as in some literary creations, run to receive the Mamodita, as Assyrians say, or the baptism? Not necessarily, that's not what the history shows, but eventually Christianity took hold of Assyria. So let's go back before Christianity arrives and talk about the legacy of the ancient Assyrians before we go forward. So this is going to be a fast-paced run through Assyrian history from the arrival or the perceived arrival of Christianity all the way to the 1800s. One thing we have to know about the Assyrians is that they kept meticulous records. They kept meticulous records, incredible records about everything: trade and war and love and peace and science, magic, religious texts, and so on, meticulously recorded. So much so that Andre Perot, the author of The Arts of Assyria, which is a fantastic book that goes past the record and gives some interpretation. He says, no other civilization has bequeathed to the world so vast a corpus of documents. That's true. In part, of course, that is true also because Assyrian records are better preserved. Clay tablets, particularly after they're burned, become very, very difficult to fall apart. So we have them, whereas, for example, papyrus documents are no longer extant. They may have disappeared. So that's one of the reasons. But the other reason is that we see other documents in other civilizations, and the level of detail contained in Assyrian records is incredible. And Assyrians were not just warriors, of course. They just did not conquer. They created some incredible items that were left behind, among them jewelry. As you can see, this is the treasures of Nimrud, as they came to be known, which is from the period of about 200 to 300 years prior to the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So you could imagine in 300 years, Assyrian skill developed even further than what you see here. So this is kind of the older material that we have access to. The newer material, sad to say, may have been looted because Assyria fell at that time, and those who conquered took the spoils and probably took a lot of the gold, melted a lot of the gold, or stole a lot of the gold, and we no longer have access to it. So after the fall of Nineveh and Haran, 612 BC was the fall of Nineveh. 609 BC was the fall of Haran. That's the last Assyrian capital, which is located in southeastern Turkey today. Assyrian administration continued under Neo-Babylonian rule. And we are told that the Assyrian countryside was prosperous. The Assyrians under the Achaemenids, or the Persian Empire, also contributed to their own country and contributed, according to Herodotus, soldiers for the Persians when the Persians encountered the Greeks under Alexander the Great, or Alexander of Macedon. So in looking at the long history that came prior to Christianity, Assyria had an incredibly long run with stability well over 1,000 years of being a powerful state. Assyrians survived the fall of their state and empire despite what some historians have said. Assyria's legacy has been unfairly tarnished. I have another video on Assyrian cruelty, and I make the argument that part of the problem is that the Assyrians were so detailed in their record keeping, not that they were more cruel than anyone else, but they just kept a good record, too good for themselves even. So they created a record which others can see, and that's not just literary, but also artistic record of what they did to their enemies, for example, which wasn't any different than what other people would do at the time. That Assyrians and scholars have a duty to correct that record, the bad record, as it were. So with that, we advance after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the fall of the Assyrian state. Alexander comes into the Middle East. He causes the downfall of the Achaemenid Empire in the year 300 BC, and conquers what is the Near East. He has a short life, of course, and then we have the creation by his generals of various smaller entities, smaller empires. These are not Greek empires. They're a mixture, Hellenistic civilizations, and the Seleucid Empire, Siluk, in Assyrian, is the one that takes over Mesopotamia, Assyria, and what is typically known as Babylonia. And one of the cities, of course, is Karkh Bet Siluk, which is Kirkuk, that remains to be explored by archaeologists. So we know the Assyrians existed during this time and went on, but there is no powerful Assyrian kingdom at this time. Then we have the arrival of the Parthians, who in turn push the Seleucids out. The Seleucid kingdom comes to an end, the empire. The Parthians come and rule. The Parthians are not Persians. They are an Iranian people from the northern area of Iran, or the area of Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, and they penetrate the area of Mesopotamia and push further, challenging Roman rule in the area. So they are around from 247 BC until AD 224. Now, when we say 33 AD, of course, what are we talking about? We're talking during the time where Parthia is a powerful kingdom, as well as Rome, of course. The Roman Empire has not been split into two as of yet. Now, the Assyrians continue, according to the historical record, continue to worship their ancient gods, and specifically in one particular city, what was the Assyrian Vatican, as we said, the city of Ashur. The Assyrians continue to administer their own city and their own and other areas, country surrounding the city of Ashur, and continue to worship the god Ashur up until at least 250 AD. In fact, the city of Ashur is rebuilt, so are certain parts of Nineveh and other older Assyrian cities. And the temple of Ashur is rebuilt. And this is a very important time for the temple of Ashur, because the temple of Ashur had been destroyed in 614 BC, so hundreds of years prior, and it is brought back. And the record shows, and of course, we're really excited that there has been new archaeology in the city of Ashur, and specifically addressing the what is called the second temple of the god Ashur. And this comes after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So did the Assyrians disappear, as some historians have said, after the fall of their empire? Clearly, the historical and archaeological record shows no, they did not. Ashur is rebuilt, as we said, and we are told by historian Tarn, during Parthian times, Aramaic inscriptions found in Ashur. So this is one important point I would like to address to all of you, and that is, when we often say the word Aramaic, certain people, certain historians respond, well, Aramaic means Aramaeans. No, Aramaic was the language of the Assyrian Empire, in addition to Akkadian. Two languages were used side by side. Aramaic became the language that is mostly used by the Assyrians. Now, what type of Aramaic was it? It was Assyrian Aramaic that is used. So during Parthian times, Aramaic inscriptions, and by the way, this passed on to, after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, passed on to the Achaemenids. It was so associated with the Assyrians that in fact, it was known as the writing of the Assyrians by Egyptians, Greeks, and Jews. And this is in the record. So largely in the Christian era, we see a body of people, among them perhaps a family of temple priests, still carrying on the worship of Ashur at the accustomed spot. They worship no other god. Their names are purely Assyrian, and Greece and Iran have left them untouched. In the 3rd century AD, there appears among them the name Sarhaddon. So this is kind of a harking back, trying to recreate the glories of their ancestors. This is about 300 years after the coming of Christianity, we must emphasize. What also arrived in Assyria was Judaism, interestingly enough, and certain Assyrians, or certain leadership of the Assyrians at this time, namely Helene of Hadyab, or Hadio, Adyabini, converts to Judaism. Now, what type of Judaism is it? Is it today's Judaism? No, it is a proselytizing faith. It is a Hellenicized type of Judaism, which is different than what we know as Rabbinic Judaism. And the focus here is on faith and belief. And of course, a good number of Assyrians, not all Assyrians, become Jewish in effect. And Helene goes back to the holy city, and she is buried, according to certain records, according to Josephus, in Jerusalem. And what you see here in the Louvre Museum is the sarcophagus of Queen Helene of Hadyab, an Assyrian queen. Now, under the Sasanians, there were two distinct versions of Christianity as the Church of the East developed, which was really the first Assyrian church, first Christian church to develop in Mesopotamia, came to be known as the Church of the East. Why is it known as the Church of the East? Because it was east of the Roman Empire. And it was also known as Nestorian, which is an unfair term, but I'm going to use this expression from Patricia Crone, who passed away, and Michael Cook in Hagerism, which is an excellent and interesting book about the development of Islam. Nevertheless, we are told that there were two distinct versions of Christianity within the Mesopotamian or Assyrian church. On the one hand, the local church of Assyria focused on Hadiyat, a chauvinist assertion of a provincial identity, meaning the Assyrian identity. On the other hand, the metropolitan church of Persia, or of the Sasanian times, with its center in Babylonia or central Iraq, a cosmopolitan assertion of a Gentile truth. But if the Assyrian church was in this respect comparable to that of Egypt, its chauvinism took a rather different form. Egypt had preserved an ethnicity and a language peculiar to itself among its peasantry, whereas its aristocracy belonged to the larger Hellenicized world. Assyria, by contrast, had an aristocracy peculiar to itself, whereas it shared its ethnicity and language with the larger Aramaic world. Well, one dispute I would have with this phrasing is that the larger Aramaic world was really based on its center being Assyria, meaning Assyria was the one to have spread the Aramaic language. So according to Assyria, just like according to Rome, Latin came from it, Rome, Aramaic came from it, meaning Assyria. Now, during this time, we have a record of Assyrians converting to different faiths. Of course, some Assyrians converted to Judaism. As we noted, some converted to Zoroastrianism, and others converted to Christianity. And as we will see, the ones who converted to Christianity gravitated to two main churches. First, the Church of the East, and later the Syriac Orthodox Church. Now, these were the two main churches at the time, and later they split, and we're going to refer to that to see the repercussions all the way up until today. Where do Assyrian churches come from? What are their roots? And so we are told by, again, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, after a detour via Judaism, which is somewhat accurate, the Assyrians adopted Christianity and found their heresy in Nestorianism. Well, it's an interesting way to phrase things. Why does she say heresy in Nestorianism? Because the Church of the East is considered by some, by Copts, for example, and even by Catholics, to be a heretical church. I'm here to tell you that's not true. All right. So did Assyria survive during Sasanian times? As you know, or as you should know, the Sasanians lasted from the fall of the Parthians all the way up to the arrival of Islam. So where was Assyria during this time? Well, we're told by Shapur in the first Roman campaign of 242 AD, when I ascended the throne of the empire, Gordinius, the Caesar, assembled a force from all of Rome, Gothia, and Germania, and meaning Spain and Germany, and came to Asuristan, which is Assyria, against the empire of Iran and us. And then there was a battle, and at Mishig, at the frontier of Ashuristan, which is Assyria, there was a great frontal battle. Now, this period is also associated with the destruction of the temple of Ashur. The temple of Ashur, as you recall, had been rebuilt during this time, and it is most likely, although the record is not entirely clear, that it was during the Sasanian times that the end came for the temple of Ashur. And of course, it did not help that an increasing number of Assyrians had converted to Christianity. With the growing of the Church of the East and the reorganization of the Christian church in Mesopotamia, there was ultimately a threat to the ancient religion of the Assyrians, and we'll see a couple of passages concerning that. In the second Roman campaign of 250 AD, we are told by Shapur, and Caesar lied again. he did wrong to Armenia, and we moved into the Roman Empire and destroyed 60,000 of the Roman forces and burned, laid waste, and made captive all of Assyria and its surroundings. So this is in reference to possibly when, during these times, the first and the second campaign, when Assyria was devastated by the Sasanians, not when they were Christian necessarily, but because they had possibly allied with the Roman armies. Now, as I said, apocryphal literature. During the time, possibly in the 4th century, most scholars think that in the 4th century, what we know as the doctrine of Mar-ad-Day and Marmari were written. And the doctrine is, as we said, apocryphal work, most likely in the 4th or 5th century, and tells of the arrival of Christianity into Assyria. And the writing is very clear. So if we're coming into the 5th and the 4th century here, the 4th or the 5th century, we are told, and those of them who became disciples received from them the hand of the priesthood, and in their own country of the Assyrians, they taught the sons of their people, and houses of prayer they built there secretly because of the danger arising from the worshippers of fire and the adorers of water. What could he be talking about? The author is possibly talking about worshippers of fire, meaning Zoroastrians. So there were certainly Assyrians or their leadership, which had practiced the Zoroastrian religion. But Narseh, king of the Assyrians, now Narseh is in Edessa. This is the kingdom of Assyria. What we know as ancient Assyria has split into various kingdoms. Urhe is one of them. Hadyab or Hadyao, Adiabene is another one. So Edessa and Adiabene. But Narseh, king of the Assyrians, when he had heard of these things which Edday the apostle had done, he sent to Abgar, the king, either send me the man who hath done these signs with thee, that I may see him and hear his discourse, or send me an account of all these things which thou hast seen him do in your city. So there's communication between these two, what may have been Roman governors who were Assyrian, who were on the path of converting from their ancient religion to Christianity. Assyrian Christianity produced some of the greatest writers, Christian writers in history that wrote in the Assyrian, or what is known as Syriac language, and I'm going to explain the word Syriac so that all of us are on the same page with this. Born in Nasiban, Mar Aprim Rabba, or Mar Aprim the Great, is one of the most famous literate saints in the history of the Assyrian language, as well as in Christianity, and wrote numerous hymns, sermons, and verse and exegesis. Not only wrote in praise of the Christian faith, but also the value of teaching and learning. He pleads in prayer, God give learning to he who desires learning, and to the teachers who teach well, make great in your kingdom. لها هو يلبانا الأين تراخم يلبانا والرب مالب شبير عويدة رب ملكوتخ. Make him great in your kingdom. This is not only a Christian theme, but it is a love of learning and literature that Assyrians have upheld from the times of the ancient Assyrian Empire. Remember Andre Perot's words that no other civilization bequeathed to us such a great corpus of documents. The School of Nasiban is the very first university in the world that was established by the Assyrians. And people think, archaeologists who may be looking into this, think that the building can be found, or the very first. Now, this is before Cordoba, before any other university in the world, before Al-Azhar, before any of the universities in the Middle East or in Europe. And what was taught here was philosophy, theology, and medicine. And the people that learned were also theologians and great people within the Assyrian church that later was split into the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Church of the East, taught at the school and spread their learning far and wide. One of those was Marnarse, who is one of the first people associated with the Church of the East. He was born in Nuhadra, which is today's Duhok, was one of the most learned teachers of the church and the rector of the school of Nasibin for about 50 years. Scholars believe that Marnarse wrote prolifically, has only about 80 of his writings surviving. And we have a scholar who is going to give a lecture about this very soon, Dr. Walsh from the University of Chicago. And he wrote on the mysteries. Of course, it's hard to really understand the depth and get a feel for the beauty of the language by reading the translation of what Marnarse wrote. But it's interesting in that he shows the Christology of the Church of the East in his poetry, and he exposes the poetry of the the Christology of the Church of the East through beautiful prose, such as the translation shows here. He remained in the tomb 3 days as man. This is the stress on the two natures of Christ that the Church of the East has. And the watchers glorified him with their praises as God. He said that he had received all authority as man, and he promised to be with us forever as God, so on and so forth. Now, as Patricia Crone and Michael Cook made known, the Assyrian Church of the East, or the Church of the East, was really two main churches within one, and that was one was a more cosmopolitan church centered on Seleucia Ctesiphon, which is in the center of Mesopotamia, and the other was centered in the north in Nineveh and Erbil and so on, which was what she termed, and both scholars termed, kind of a chauvinistic or more national church, a less cosmopolitan church. But the reason that the church, which was first established in Erbil before it was established in the center of Mesopotamia, the reason that the church moved was because we're dealing here with the Sasanian Empire, which has at its center Silok-Tisfon, which is the old Parthian and Seleucid city, the two cities that are brought together. And this is where the Church of the East settles, where the center or the head of the Assyrian Church of the East is. And this is why it is known as oftentimes as the Church of Persia or the Persian Church, or Itet Kuche. Kuche is this location here, which is Silok Tisfon. And from here, all of the great missionary enterprises, as well as from northern Mesopotamia or Assyria, go forth into Asia and convert large numbers of people, possibly, according to some authors, although it's hard for us to know the exact number, possibly more people than were contained in the Orthodox and Catholic churches combined, in the Roman or Byzantine churches combined. So the Assyrian missionary effort is possibly the greatest of any church in the world, and it begins in this location. Now, did some Assyrians all the way close to 500 AD still have traces of their ancient religion, or did they still practice? Well, we see here that Joshua, the stylites are people who supposedly would sit on top of pillars, which were ancient pillars, and would meditate on these pillars, much like Buddhist monks, for example. And we have the writing here in the city of the moon god, a reference to people who may still be worshiping an ancient religion. So we're told there by him, by Joshua, there came round again the time of that festival at which the pagan myths, and so this is a reference to ancient religion, um, ancient Assyrian religion. Ancient pagan myths used to be recited, and the citizens took even more pains about than usual. For these reasons, they neglected to go to prayer, meaning Christian prayer, and not one of them bestowed a thought on his duty. A proof of God's justice was manifested towards us for the correction of our even conduct. For in the month of Yar, when the day arrived for the celebration of the wicked heathen festival, he calls it, there came a vast quantity of locusts into the country from the south, into our country from the south. So here we are told that God has cursed us because we are engaging in bringing back an ancient a religious festival, and this is, of course, none other than Chag Nisan. Now, monasteries and churches dotted the entire countryside of Assyria by this time, and many of the saints of these monasteries have Assyrian roots, such as Marqardach and Marbehnam. And where does this come from? Obviously, it's not from the Bible. Oftentimes the argument is, well, the Assyrians learned that they're Assyrian, and we're gonna discuss this in future lectures. The Assyrians learned that they're Assyrian from the Bible, according to a number of authors, but that's not true. That is countered by the record as well as by the archaeological evidence that, in fact, there are traces of ancient Assyrian references left among the people who became Jewish, who became Zoroastrian, and ultimately became Christian in the two main churches that lived on until this day. And those two churches are, of course, the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church. And of course, those two split from the Church of the East into the Chaldean Church, and then further to the ancient Church of the East. So we have three churches of the East in effect, and then we have two Syriac Orthodox churches, and that is the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Syriac Catholic Church, all really from the same Assyrian Christianity that we are talking about here. Now, during the time of the Sasanians, we have many martyrdoms, the most prominent of them being Good Friday, 341 AD. And this is the time when Marshamun Barsabai, who was the head of the church in Salih Tisfon, is told by Shapur, the Persian, Shapur II, the Persian emperor, that he must comply with, as a struggle is being undertaken against Rome, that he must comply with members of the Church of the East clergy going about collecting taxes from their people because it is important for the state. So I just want to say one thing about this period of time. We are told by one historian, rather absurdly, I should say, that this wasn't really persecution. This was an attempt to co-opt and obtain the cooperation of the Church of the East and its members by allowing them or coercing them or influencing them to collect taxes from their own people to be kind of part of the larger effort of the Sasanian Empire. And so that's why they were slaughtered in large numbers to kind of get them to feel that they should become part of this empire, Iran Shah, as it were. But this is, of course, an absurd view. We are told that up to 16,000 martyrs from the Church of the East, Assyrians and those who converted within the Church of the East were martyred. And among them was, of course, Marshamun Barsabai. And there are many stories, some apocryphal, some more accurate, I would gather, about how they were slaughtered and at times allowed to convert to get out of. Now, this wasn't Islam. Remember, religion of the Sasanians, Zoroastrianism. So they were allowed to convert, we are told, but they refused to convert from Christianity and were true to their Christian faith and submitted to martyrdom. And of course, this story is told and retold over the centuries and is always remembered. In fact, there's a church of Marshamun Barsabai to this day in Assyria, or in the area of Nala. Now, one of the problems that the Assyrians had is that their geography rested in between two powers clashing against each other. It was the Sasanian Empire against the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire. And this allowed the Assyrians the misfortune of having to try to become neutral or to get out of their problem by being on this side or that side. In other words, to decide to advocate for one side versus another. So this was obviously very problematical for the Assyrians, and they did the best they could. But of course, they suffered most likely from both sides, from both the Sasanians and the Byzantines. Whether it was because of Christology or a political position they took, or because they were perceived to be sympathetic to Christians outside of the empire of the Sasanians, the Assyrians suffered nevertheless. So the last years of the Sasanian Empire before the arrival of the Arabs and the arrival of Islam, what came to be known as Islam, the Church of the East was undergoing turmoil. Now, when we talk about the Church of the East, I want you to keep in mind that this is the organization that is left for the Assyrians at this time that we know of. So there might be, for example, town leaders, there might be town administrators, but we just don't have extensive records. Rather, we have religious leaders, primarily of the Church of the East, that are respected by non-Assyrian authorities, such as the Sasanians and the Byzantines, and are held to a standard where they are, practically speaking, really the heads of state as far as the Assyrians are concerned. So it's the Church of the East that takes this role at this time. The Sasanian king Khosrow II forbids the election of a new patriarch after the death of his friend, Patriarch Margivergis I. Seat remains vacant until the death of Khosrow II. The Church of the East is rife with internal quarrels, disagreements among ecclesiastics regarding central authority of the patriarch. Now, some of these, I'm not going to get into it too much here, but some of them may be along ethnic lines. So, for example, Persians who have become members of the Church of the East disputing the authority of the patriarch, who was an Assyrian or Syriac speaking. Rise of competing Syriac Orthodox hierarchy, which refused to accept the authority of the Patriarch and the Church of the East within the East, within the Sasanian Empire. During this period, the Syriac Orthodox Church organizes within Sasanian territory, this is the first time, its territory now becomes Syria and Mesopotamia or Assyria, and a Mafriono or a Mafrian is appointed in Mesopotamia, mainly in Tikrit, with the consecration of Marmarutha of Tikrit as the head of the Syriac Orthodox Church in Sasanian territory now is formal. And Marmarutha, of course, was a member of the Church of the East prior to that. We have a good lecture coming up on this topic by a Father Sharbel of the Syriac Orthodox Church. Now, Islam comes, and Assyrians view Islam in many different ways. One way is sympathetic. Why? Because they are tired of the wars between the Byzantines and the Sasanians, because of these constant clashes, these constant conflicts that take a toll on the Assyrian people and on the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church as well. So important to remember that Assyria continued to exist, and it is referred to in many sources. Assyria is known during Islamic times. It is often referred to as Athur or Akur in certain places, and that area is, of course, Mosul, northern Iraq, which is typically the Assyrian territory. Three themes are important to keep in mind to take away from this period. The Muslim invasion or the Arab invasion was not sudden. It was not quick. It happened over a period of time. Islam did not come into these areas as a religion. It became oppressive later. And what we remember from this time is the Pact of Omar ibn Khattab. Assyrians contributed to the intellectual culture of the Abbasids, the age of translations that sparked the Islamic Golden Age, which in turn sparked the European Renaissance. So Assyrians continued to play a role, and I would argue that that role has been diminished by many authors who do not attribute enough to the work of the Assyrians, which came not just simply because they were Assyrians, but also because they brought this Mesopotamian legacy, which was something that the Arabs came to know. They didn't come to Mesopotamia with this legacy. Assyrian Christians had internal conflicts. The clergy were rulers of the community, and the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church were in conflict. There's constant conflict between these two bodies. The Khulafa, the Caliphate. By the way, the word comes from the Assyrian word khlab, which means instead of. The Caliphate is instead of or representative of God. Rashidun, which is the rightly guided ones, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali ibn Talib. The Umayyad Caliphate is from 661 to 750, approximately. Abbasid Caliphate comes afterwards, 750 to 1258. And during this time, the Assyrians continued to live in the area of northern Mesopotamia, and it is thought that there is increasing migration to the north, for example, to the areas of Tur ad-Din and other places which are more inaccessible. So there's kind of a push as Islam becomes a more dominant faith, not only, by the way, at times violent, not only violent and military movement, but also one of taxation. And we'll refer to that. So Assyria remains, but the Sunni Shia schism occurs at this time. Impact on Assyria is still minimal. This Sunni Shia split takes place mostly in the south. The Arabs focused largely on the south of Mesopotamia. Material evidence shows that Nineveh was a main center during both Parthian and Sasanian times and continued to be an important place where many Assyrians lived. Mosul was established across the river from Nineveh. And of course, today, if you look at a map, you will see that Mosul has kind of taken over, and Nineveh, the ancient city of Nineveh, is a small area within this larger area of Mosul. But of course, the entire governorate now around the city of Mosul is also known as Nineveh, Muhafadat Nainawa in Arabic. So, what do we know about Islam from the eyes of the Assyrians? And there are several books that have recently come out about the view that Christians first had of Muslims during this time. So, we are told by Thomas the Presbyter, who was possibly an eyewitness, in the year 945 or 634, at the ninth hour, there was a battle between the Romans and the Arabs of Muhammad, Tayyayat Muhammad. Tayyaya, of course, is a particular group of Arabs. There was a fight in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza, Gaza undergoing tremendous horrors these days. The Romans fled, leaving behind the patrician Bryden, whom the Arabs killed. Some 4,000 poor villagers of Palestine were killed there. Now, most of these were Christian, of course. Christians, Jews, and Samaritans, the Arabs ravaged the whole region. In the year 947 or 635 to 36, the Arabs invaded the whole of Syria and went down to Persia and conquered it. The Arabs climbed the mountain of Mardin in the area of Tur Abdin and killed many monks there in the monasteries of Qidar and Bnatha. There died the blessed man Simon or Shummun, doorkeeper of Qidar, brother of Thomas the priest. So these references are often found in colophons, meaning written on the sides of manuscripts, and they give us a glimpse, a much more accurate glimpse of the arrival of Islam than, for example, Latin sources, Greek or Roman sources. They're all written in the Assyrian or Syriac language. We see notes in the Gospel of Matthew written thus: in January, the people of Hims took the word for their lives or surrendered, meaning salam, Islam, and many villagers were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Muhammad. And many people were slain and taken prisoner from Galilee as far as Beth, continues on. On the 26th day of May, the Safara went from the vicinity of the Romans and chased them, or the Romans chased them. On the 10th of August, the Romans fled from the vicinity of Damascus, and there were killed many people, some 10,000. We don't know about the numbers here. There may be exaggerations with the numbers. We're not certain, of course. And at the turn of the year, the Romans came. On the 20th of August in the year 947, they're gathered in Gabitha. A multitude of the Romans and many people of the Romans were killed, some 50,000. So this shows a back and forth between the Byzantines and the Arabs. And it also shows a decline in the power of the Sasanians. The Sasanians, of course, completely fall eventually, whereas the Byzantines remain, only to be defeated later by the Ottoman Turks or by the Ottomans. Now, the emergence of Islam comes not necessarily from the entry of these forces of the Arabs, but by the coming of Abdul Malik, a caliph in Islam. This is when we begin to see that what emerges as Islam is something that is separate, because previously, as many scholars emphasized, that it was really a movement of the mu'mineen, or believers in Arabic. It was a movement of the believers, but believers in what? It wasn't very specific. Now there's a redefinition of this group, and the Dome of the Rock, which is in Jerusalem today, critiques the concept of the Trinity as known by Christians. And at this time, of course, Assyrians are almost entirely Christian. O you people of the book, overstep not bounds in your religion, and of God speak only the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, is only an apostle of God, Rasulullah. Believe therefore in God and his apostle, and say not three, meaning the Trinity, it will be better for you. God is only one God. Far be it from his glory that he should have a son. So, this is a clear distinction for many historians that Islam had come to be shaped. It's not prior to this. This is the only time that we see, and this takes place something like 100 years after the arrival of Muhammad. There is a millet system formed, and this is taken by the Muslims from the Sasanians. And the millet system is another system of taxation. So now the Assyrians, having endured the rule of the Sasanians and the Byzantines, now come to endure the rule of the Arabs under a new type of oppression, which is in the form of Islam. Now, the Assyrians, even during these very difficult times, had conflicts among themselves, namely between the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church. Remember, there's no such thing as the Chaldean Church at this time. It is mainly the Church of the East, which is the larger part of Mesopotamia, and proceeding towards Persia and other eastern areas, and then the Syriac Orthodox Church, which is gaining strength within Mesopotamia. And we are told by Ishuyo, Mar Ishuyo, the third, an Assyrian patriarch, with silver incantations and golden supplications, the Monophysites, meaning the Syriac Orthodox, won the indulgence of the present-day governors, the rulers of the area, and had even gained permission to build a church at the gates of Nineveh. And he makes reference to this, meaning that previously the Syriac Orthodox Church was not allowed to build in Nineveh or outside of the gates of Nineveh. Now, in fact, they are. And of course, who are these members of the Syriac Orthodox Church? They're not arrivals from a different land. They are, many of them, most of them are Assyrians, natives to Mesopotamia. So the Syriac Orthodox Church gains power in Mesopotamia. It is a Miaphysite church, meaning what we call one nature church, although it's not really one nature. I'm not going to get into the whole dispute here. Is evidenced for the first time in 575. Another called the New Church was built in 580 on the Palace of the Church of the East, Great Church at the Royal Court in Kyuche, which is Siluk Tisfon, which has been the seat of the patriarch. And so the church now begins to gain hold in Mesopotamia, the Syriac Orthodox Church, which is certainly something new. Now we're told that a tyrannical rule comes with what we call the Pact of Omar ibn Khattab, and this is a pact that expands the Islamic power. It has a treaty with a group of Christians who surrender early in 634. Restrictions are imposed on building of churches and dress of non-Muslims, those who don't convert. Scholars question the authenticity of this pact, but it's clear that Islamic rule pervaded the entire Near East at this time and impacted non-Muslims. There is a poll tax that is paid by non-Muslims for protection, in addition to the land tax. So the people who are conquered now have to pay double taxation if they are non-Muslims. Sources show that Christian bishops asked for exemptions, but not for the general population, but only for themselves, priests, bishops, and so on. As pressure and violence increased, movement is away from Christianity and towards Islam. So there is definitely a process of conversion here, though one must understand also the economic repercussions of that. The more people convert to Islam, the revenue coming into the government, the Islamic government, is reduced. The Muslims do not know nor wish to say at this that this true Messiah who came and is acknowledged by the Christians is God and the Son of God. This is, by the way, I'm sorry, I should have introduced Mariaku of Urhe or Edessa, Saint Jacob of Edessa. They nevertheless confess firmly that he is a true Messiah who was to come and who was foretold by the prophets. Now, remember, we often use this term Abrahamic faith. So Islam is like Christianity, and there's much dispute about this. This is a rather recently invented term. It's been around, but it's recently invented, Abrahamic. There is this belief in the holy books, but not exactly. But Islam does believe that Jesus was someone who's a very important prophet in Islam as well as in Christianity, but not to the level, as we mentioned before, of being the Son of God. So there's definitely no acceptance of the concept of Trinity as it is known in Christianity. So for Judaism and for Islam, there is one God and one God alone. In Christianity, God is understood as three attributes: Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. They say to all at all times that Jesus, the Son of Mary, is the truth, the Messiah, and they call him the Word of God. And they also say that he is living. They also add in their ignorance that he is the Spirit of God, for they are not able to distinguish between word and spirit, just as they do not assent to call the Messiah God or Son of God. So there is clearly this division, which is going to cause problems for Christians, and the Christians are going to, over time, lose ground to the Islamic faith. Well, regardless, the Christians and Assyrians as Christians participated in building up the power and the intellect of the Islamic Empire, the new Islamic Empire, new Arab Empire, and translated many of the works of Aristotle and Plato and other classical authors, Roman and Greek authors, into the Assyrian language, into Syriac, and then from there into Arabic. So many of the translators were also physicians, they were learned people, and they were part of this effort that is known as Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad, which is the house of wisdom. Now, what was it? Was this a library? Was it a gathering place? Various scholars think that it was a gathering of scholars that were brought together by the caliph, and many of them happen to be Assyrian or Assyrian speaking and Christian. Now, as we said before, this is part of the legacy, civilizational legacy of Assyria specifically, as going back in time to the love of knowledge that was fostered by Assyrian kings, not just Ashurbanipal, but Ashurbanipal most prominently, but other Assyrian kings who also built up libraries before him. And so this legacy did not disappear. As we said, prior to the arrival of Islam, there was the formation of what we came to know as the University of Nasibin, Bitsolbet Nasibin, which was the first university established studying medicine, philosophy, and theology. And it also has canons, rules of conduct for the students and the teachers. So this Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, has roots, as we said, in the Ashurbanipal Library, as well as the School of Nasibin and the School of Edessa prior. And so Assyrians contributed. This is a painting by Denkhazumaya, which is an imagined, of course, gathering at the Beit al-Hikmah. And in this gathering, there are three languages that are used: Greek, Assyrian or Syriac and Arabic. So one of the great Assyrian leaders during this time, after the arrival of Islam, is Timotheus. And I mentioned Timotheus, who was born in Hadia, in Hazza, in Erbil, what was left of ancient Assyria, which wasn't destroyed. The city of Erbil continued to exist, and it was a clearly Assyrian city, and it was in fact known as the capital of the Assyrians, according to a number of scholars. Timotheus was a very intellectual, a very learned patriarch, and he was facing difficult times because this was a time when things had changed, had transformed, and this new faith was beginning to build pressure on his people. So there was the question of whether we assimilate or whether we don't assimilate. So there are, of course, repercussions, and you have to be careful. If you push too far one way, similar to other times that Assyrians operated in, you may be killed off. So you may disappear through the sword. If you push too much the other way to assimilate, you may disappear through assimilation into a different faith and a different language and so on. So in his writings, we are told he criticizes, we are told that people sue and litigate not before the saints, but before the wicked. It is as though they do not possess, as it were, laws and rulings that are appropriate for this world and for the conduct of moral people. So in this, they transgress both the apostolic and the divine law, which commands believers and everyone, even, that they should be judged not before the wicked, but rather before the saints, meaning stay within your Christian faith, stay within your community. That's what this passage is about. And that the ones who should judge are those by whom the angels, together with the whole world, will be judged. So the concern here is about the dissolution of the Assyrian people, of the Assyrian Christian people during this time. The Assyrian community, through its legacy, had always, through its past in the Middle East, had always walked a fine line of balance. We are told by a number of scholars, particularly Andrew Platt, a potentially hostile state and remaining offset from it, either deal with this hostile state or be offset. Even as the head of the Church of the East advocated for Assyrian scholars to translate philosophy and Assyrian doctors to reside in proximity of the caliph, he sought to cordon off his flock from exposure to anything that would lead them towards the conversion to Islam and the assimilation that resulted from it. Remember, this was a major concern of Timotheus, who probably witnessed the Islamization of many Assyrian Christians during this time and clearly it was known, some for personal gain. Some were pressured, but others did so for personal gain. So in one of the canons, we are told, is it right for a Christian man or woman in arbitration of disputes to seek the judgment of outsiders, meaning Muslims? If they are Christians, how can they go to non-Christian judges? God speaks to them through the mouth of his prophet Elijah. Is there no God in Israel that you go to inquire of Beelzebub, or Satan, the god of Ekron? If they go, this is, of course, a reference to the Old Testament. If they go to non-Christian judges, how can they be Christians? Paul speaks to them, you cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of another. You cannot drink the cup of our Lord and the cup of a liar. Therefore, when people dare to transgress the apostolic rule, they must do penance and almsgiving and stand in sackcloth and ashes. Qutma ujwala. So Time passes and there is a slow disintegration despite the warnings of Timotheus of the Assyrians, and there is a decline of the Church of the East. And slowly but surely, the Church of the East declines. There were 68 cities with residents of the Church of the East bishops at one time, and this is in the year 1000. 200 years later, there were only 24. So cut by 2/3. And at the death of Timur, who is, of course, a major contributor to the destruction of the Church of the East, there were only 7 in 1405. So you could see the devastation and the demise of the Church of the East. Now, part of this had to do with disease. Disease also has a major impact on history, but Timur had a lot to do with it. And Timur, of course, born in 1370, lived to 1405 approximately, had devastated many of the churches of the East, and had caused possibly the Assyrians to migrate into what is known as the Hakkari area today, into southeastern Turkey today. Despite the decline, the church survived, and it survived in the Assyrian provinces largely. So it disappeared from many of the areas, but it survived in the area of Tur Abdin, in the area of Hakkari, in the Nineveh plain, and in and around the area of Urmia. Now, conversion to Islam was one very important fact that we need to consider. One scholar argued that there was a 50% conversion rate in the year 975. 50% conversion rate. This is 100 years after the coming of Timotheus. Excuse me. His model argues, this author's model argues for a gradual slide into Islam due to attraction, increased opportunity, etc., also pressure. Another author, Michael Moroney and Hugh Kennedy, seem to concur with Boulay's model that there was approximately a 50% conversion rate. Now, I'm going to skip a couple of these slides to tell you that, and I'm going to end here and take your questions, although I'm not really finished with all the slides. I will send these to you to look at if you ask for them in PDF format. But I want to tell you that a common phenomenon, in addition to conversion, was that churches, traditional churches, which were in turn built on ancient Assyrian sites, ancient Assyrian, not only palaces, but also ancient Assyrian temples, were turned into mosques. So this was very common, and it became a pattern that was throughout the Near East and throughout the Assyrian homeland. And one of these was what is called Nebi Yunus. And I'm going to end with this, but tell you an interesting story that the tomb of Nebi Yunus is thought to be the tomb of Jonah, who survived the swallowing of by the whale. But this, in fact, is not the case. This tomb, in fact, was this place, in fact, was an Assyrian monastery of the Church of the East, and it housed the bones of Marchnanishu, patriarch of the Church of the East from 685 to 701. Later, of course, a new apocryphal Islamic literature arises, and it is attributed to Jonah, and the Islamic leaders, Muslim leaders that come afterwards, start to build up further legends and contribute to the building of what is known as Nebi Yunus, or Prophet Jonah in Arabic, and begin to build their own existence. And in fact, Mongol rulers came and contributed to the building um, building further on it. And so the idea that this was once the Church of the East had long been lost until, of course, ISIS came in a few years ago and blew up. Kind of a puzzle as to why they did this, but ISIS, of course, believes in a Salafist version of Islam, which means to wipe away all edifices on earth other than those that revere God. So any kind of a prophet is not acceptable to ISIS. Certainly not. Certainly, this is the stated version. Now there may be other motivations, but after this mosque was destroyed, this edifice was destroyed, this building was destroyed, we found, lo and behold, that there was a monastery and also an Assyrian palace and a temple underneath. So somehow history has a way of showing up again and again. Rather interesting.